Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something darker than usual. This isn't just about shadows in the corner. This is about the things that linger when life, and sometimes death, doesn't quite stick to the script. We're going deep into a place where the rain whispers against your window, the power hums low, and the quiet is so heavy it feels like it's pressing down on your chest. You might want to grab a warm blanket, maybe check that your doors are locked, because once you step into the world of the blue moon counter, there's no turning back. If you hear knocking behind you, just ignore it. It's probably nothing. Probably. This isn't just a story. It's a confession about the last 3 years you've spent running a small diner off a forgotten highway. It's called Blue Ridge Diner, named after mountains you rarely see. But you secretly call it the Blue Moon Counter because of the flickering, half-broken neon sign out front that only glows blue and red. You've been meaning to fix that sign, but you know life. Inside, it's all retro chrome and the kind of red leather booths that your father, who owned it before you, used to say had character. You didn't plan on this life. You had different dreams. The city, a steady career, maybe a passport full of stamps. But then your father, a good man, just vanished one day in a sudden, sharp, terrible moment, a heart attack during your last year of college. One moment he was pouring coffee, the next he was gone. That's life, you guess. You came back to settle things, but somehow you just stayed. Now, you're wiping the same counter every morning, flipping the open sign at 6, and locking up at 10. This diner, it's the only real, tangible thing he left you, and letting it go felt like losing him all over again. So you stayed. For 3 years, you've maintained this small orbit. It's not a bustling place. Usually, it's just the low, familiar hum of the old jukebox in the corner, and the occasional lone trucker or confused traveler. Regulars are almost mythical, but the trickle of customers is just enough to keep the lights humming. The coffee is strong, the food is surprisingly good, and the pie, his recipe, is truly perfect. People rave about that pie, but they never seem to come back a second time. That's just fine by you. You live upstairs in the tiny apartment. It's small, cozy, with a kitchenette and a bed that sags right in the middle. A physical representation of how exhausted you feel. You spend your nights making a sandwich, watching old movies, and enjoying the quiet predictability of it all. That quiet gives you time to think, time to remember, time to reflect on the one thing that makes this diner unlike any other, the secret that keeps the dust settled and the atmosphere heavy. Researchers still argue whether the Cottard delusion, the feeling that you are literally dead, or that the world around you is unreal, is a primary delusion or a symptom of depression. But the core feeling, the lack of reality, is something you feel every time you see the ritual performed. This place, this counter, this flickering neon, it all holds a secret, and if it ever got out, it would ruin everything. You don't know how the secret started, or who first accidentally stumbled upon it, You've seen it enough times to know it's devastatingly real. If you order one specific item, just a plain black coffee, nothing added, no sugar, no cream, and you follow the unspoken rules, you can talk to someone who is gone, someone you've lost. They will appear right across from you in the booth, looking exactly as you remember, and you can speak to them until the cup goes cold. So, before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're brave enough to handle what's coming. Comment down below with your location and what time it is right now. Now, turn off the lights, maybe keep one candle burning, and let's begin tonight's haunting together. You just poured a fresh pot, the dark liquid bubbling gently, ready for the next lost soul. The coffee ritual isn't an urban legend, it's a service. A terrible, wonderful, finite service, and the rules, as you've learned from your father's quiet warnings, are simple, but absolutely unbending. You didn't write them, and you certainly don't know the metaphysical mechanics behind them. You only know that they work. Rule 1. You have to drink the coffee before it gets cold. No exceptions. If you fail, the specter across from you leaves, instantly, permanently, and you can never, ever bring them back. Rule 2. You can't touch them. The reasons for this are murky, part of the core, untouchable, non-negotiable bargain. Maybe it's a boundary, a separation between the two worlds that contact shatters, or maybe it's a protection for them or for you. Rule 3. You can only do it once. One coffee, one conversation, period. There are no repeats, no second chances, no just one more question. That finality is the cruelest part of the deal. Your father was the one who told you about the ritual before he died. He said it had been part of the diner's fabric for longer than he could remember. He also told you he never used it, and you, standing behind the counter, pouring for the bereaved, haven't used it either. It's too final, too devastatingly personal. It's one thing to facilitate closure for others. It's another thing entirely to spend your one single coin. It was a quiet, damp Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the clouds hang low and press the light out of the sky. When the first anomaly walked in, you were behind the counter, trying to find a new pattern in the same streak you'd already cleaned 3 times. A nervous habit. When the door jingle cut through the silence, he was tall, thin, moving with a frayed, nervous energy, dark circles under his eyes that suggested sleeplessness measured in weeks, not days. He paused just inside the door, taking in the empty, silent booths and the low, lonely thrum of the jukebox. He didn't look lost, only utterly spent. He made a beeline for the counter, not a booth. Coffee, he said, the word clipped and precise as he slid onto a stool. Black, he nodded, following the muscle memory of the 3-year routine, grabbing a mug and pouring from the perpetually full pot as you set the dark liquid in front of him. He looked up, his eyes sharp and searching, cutting through your calm demeanor. "This is the place, right?" he asked. You froze for a fraction of a second, the the rag caught in your hand, then forced yourself to keep moving, wiping your already dry hands on a towel. "What place?" He insisted, his gaze heavy. "The place where you can talk to someone." You didn't answer immediately. Most people who stumble upon the ritual don't know about it. They hear whispers, stumble on a strange coincidence, or find it purely by accident. This man, however, he wasn't guessing. He knew the terms of engagement. "Who told you that?" you asked, your voice flat. "A friend," he said, his fingers drumming a frantic, silent rhythm on the worn counter. "Is it true?" You glanced around the empty, silent diner, the air thick with unspoken history. If you're asking, you already know the answer. The small truth made his shoulders slump, a visible deflation, like he'd been holding a breath for a decade, and finally let it out. It's fascinating how the mere confirmation of the ritual strips away the last bit of skepticism, leaving only raw, exposed need. It reminds you of the old folklore of crossroads deals. You know the consequence, but you need the wish so badly, you agree anyway. "How does it work?" he whispered. You leaned against the counter, crossing your arms, adopting the posture of the silent, objective facilitator. You order a coffee, you drink it, they show up. Simple as that. The simplicity is the lie, the complexity is the cost. He stared at the mug in front of him, the dark, bitter surface reflecting the dim ceiling lights. His hands, resting on the counter edge, trembled slightly, betraying the calm front he was trying to maintain. You realize that in this moment, the coffee isn't a beverage, it's a keyhole into the past, and he's terrified of what he might see on the other side. "And they look real," he managed to ask, his voice barely above a rasp. "Yeah," you affirmed, the word dull in the quiet air. "Real enough. They don't look like ghosts, not in the traditional, shimmering, sheet-wearing sense. They look like flesh and blood, solid, present, but always with a faint, almost imperceptible lack of color, like a photograph slightly faded by time. It's subtle, but you've seen it enough to recognize the spectral presence. And I can ask them anything, talk about anything." You nodded, repeating the critical, looming limitation. "Until the coffee goes cold. That is the hard timer on their finite closure. Once the heat dissipates, the connection snaps. It's a literal and emotional race against entropy." You watched as he finally picked up the mug. His hand shook so violently that a bead of coffee sloshed over the rim, staining the counter a dark brown. He took a hesitant sip, wincing slightly at the black bitterness, then set it down. For a suspended moment, nothing happened. The diner remained silent, the jukebox still humming its low tune, the neon light outside still flickering its broken promise. The whole world felt entirely normal, which only served to amplify the strangeness of what was about to occur. Then you felt it. Slowly, subtly, the air in the diner seemed to shift, to thicken. It wasn't a visible change, or an audible one, no claps of thunder, no dramatic special effects. It was purely a feeling, a sudden, cold weight, like the room had collectively held its breath. And now you were all waiting for the exhale. And then she was there. She simply appeared in the booth directly across from the man's stool, looking as perfectly solid and real as if she had just walked in off the street in the pouring rain. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, with long, light blonde hair. She had a soft smile that didn't quite make it all the way to her eyes, which were themselves a little too sad for her face. The man stared, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, struggling to find the vocabulary for impossible reunion. He was paralyzed by the sight of her perfect, intact presence. "Hi, Sam," she said, her voice soft, warm, and entirely normal, cutting through the heavy silence. "Emma," he finally whispered, the name catching in his throat and cracking his voice. "Is it really you?" You immediately turned away, busying yourself with the mundane ritual of cleaning the counter for the 4th time. You didn't want to hear. In this place, privacy is a courtesy, a thin, necessary shield against the raw, exposed grief. The conversations are not your business. You are merely the custodian of the gate. You wiped the counter, refilled napkin dispensers, stacked sugar packets, anything to keep your hands busy, and your ears focused on the gentle click of the jukebox and the quiet hiss of the fryer, ignoring the hushed, urgent conversation taking place just a few feet away. Did you know that sleep paralysis is often accompanied by realistic, terrifying hallucinations? People report seeing malevolent figures, the old hag being a common one in folklore, sitting on their chest, precisely because the brain wakes up before the body's motor functions do. It's a perfect example of the mind creating horror out of physical constraint, much like this coffee ritual creates a perfect reunion out of a metaphysical constraint. By the time the dark, rich coffee in Sam's mug was approaching the halfway mark, you could sense the conversation winding down, the inevitable ending drawing near. Sam's voice was desperate now, thick with hurried, desperate emotion, trying to compress a lifetime of unsaid things into a few final, vanishing minutes. You didn't need to look to know that Emma was fading. The atmosphere was thinning, the heavy silence lifting. That's always how it ends. The coffee goes cold, and they simply vanish, leaving behind nothing but an empty mug and the cavernous space of a lot of unanswered questions. The sheer psychological weight of that sudden, cold absence is enough to make a rational person doubt everything. Researchers still argue whether the grief response, when it's delayed or interrupted, creates a neurological pathway that manifests as persistent phantom memories or even full-blown hallucination. But the profound emotional reality of the customer's experience here is undeniable. When the inevitable moment arrived and the connection was severed, Sam sat there for a long time, utterly still, staring at the empty leather booth across from him. The silence was a palpable, crushing weight, heavier than the moment Emma had appeared. You waited, cleaning the stainless steel of the counter, the rag moving in slow, deliberate circles, giving him the space he needed to translate spectral reality back into mortal grief. Finally, he stirred. He turned to you, his face pale and stark, his eyes red and wet. "Thank you," he said, the words a raw whisper. You nodded, accepting the thanks that wasn't for you, but for the impossible magic you custodied. "You're welcome," you replied. He slid off the stool, moving stiffly, like a mannequin coming unstuck. At the door, he hesitated, looking back at you, a silent question lingering in his gaze. He looked like he wanted to ask more, to know the why and the how, but the terms of the deal, the silence, the single chance, seemed to hold him back. He didn't press you, just gave a small, jerky nod and left, the bell over the door jingling softly, a sad, final chime. You watched him go, then turned back to the counter, where the empty ceramic mug sat. A faint, dark ring of cold coffee staining the very bottom. You picked it up, ran it through the industrial washer, and placed it back on the shelf, ready for the next desperate soul. The quiet returned, but it was a different quiet now, lighter. Having expelled a moment of intense grief, it was late afternoon when the doorbell jingled again. A young woman stepped inside, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hair pulled back in a messy, careless ponytail. She couldn't have been older than 19 or 20. She looked around the empty diner, her eyes pausing on the very booth Sam had occupied, a strange, knowing sense about her. Finally, her gaze settled on you behind the counter. "Hi," she said, her voice uncertain, tentative, like she was asking for directions to an impossible address. "Are you Rick? You allow people to use that name. It's easier than the alternative." "That's me," you confirmed. "What can I get you?" She hesitated, chewing nervously on her lip. I heard you can do something here. Something special." You leaned against the counter, crossing your arms again, ready for the dance of denial and confirmation. Depends on what you mean by special. Her cheeks flushed a light red, and she looked down, then away. I want to talk to my grandmother, just for a little bit. Is that okay?" You studied her, noting the lack of deep, consuming grief, replaced instead by a kind of focused anxiety. This was different. She wasn't seeking closure, she was seeking guidance. You nodded. "Yeah, that's okay. You know the rules." She shook her head, confessing her ignorance of the dark contract. You recited the immutable laws. Drink the coffee before it goes cold. Don't touch them, and you only get one chance. Got it. She nodded quickly, her hands fiddling with the strap of her heavy backpack, the urgency of her need overriding any fear. Got it. You poured the black coffee, the ritual now deeply ingrained, and set the mug on the counter. She picked it up with extreme care, treating it like it was something fragile, a delicate glass bomb, and carried it to a booth near the window. The filtered light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the belief in a guardian angel or a comforting spirit of a deceased relative is a cross-cultural phenomenon, a universal human tendency externalize protective guidance. This girl, you realize, isn't asking for an angel. She's asking for a consultant. She sat there for a moment, just staring at the mug, wrestling with the commitment of the first sip. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she raised the mug to her lips and drank. The moment she swallowed the first bitter gulp, the diner grew quiet. Not empty quiet, but a heavy, charged silence, thick with expectation. The kind of stillness that precedes a major weather event. You remained behind the counter, a passive observer, granting her the required space. It never takes long once the contract is physically sealed. The manifestation is usually immediate. A woman appeared across from her. Her hair was silver, her face mapped with the gentle lines of a long, kind life. She looked exactly as you'd imagine a beloved grandmother should look, warm, soft, and radiating a sense of profound, unconditional kindness. You didn't actively eavesdrop, but the acoustics in the small, empty diner carry every word, their voices floating across the room. "I don't know what to do, Grandma," the young woman said, her voice shaking with the burden of choice. "I got into 2 schools. One's close to home, but the other is in California. I don't know which one to pick." The older woman, the grandmother, reached out. It was a perfect, instinctual, loving gesture, the automatic motion of a hand reaching out to comfort, but she stopped just short, her fingers hovering an inch above the tabletop, perfectly respecting the terrible, immutable rule of no touching. It's a striking sight, the emotional connection screaming for contact, and the metaphysical boundary holding the hand back. "Follow your heart, honey," the ghost advised, her voice carrying the wisdom of the grave. "Do what feels right, but don't be afraid to take a chance. Sometimes the best things come when you step outside your comfort zone." They continued talking for a little while, their conversation gentle, intimate, and full of that kind of deep, generational love that makes your chest ache in sympathy. You realize this is the best use of the ritual, not a frantic attempt to claw back an unfinished moment, but a serene moment of consultation and blessing. As the coffee neared its end, the young woman's voice grew hurried, desperate, trying to stretch the conversation against the inevitable clock. "I miss you so much," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I know, sweetheart," the grandmother replied, her voice firm with comfort. "But I'm always with you. You'll be okay." And then she was simply gone. The young woman sat for a few moments longer, wiping her eyes. She eventually rose and returned to the counter, setting the empty mug down. Her face was still damp from tears, but she gave you a genuine, relieved smile, filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "That meant everything to me." You nodded, not trusting yourself to speak too much, maintaining the required distance. "Good luck with school," you managed. She smiled one last time, turned, and left, the soft jingle of the doorbell marking her passage back into the uncertain world. You watched the empty booth, the residual warmth of their exchange lingering, the phenomenon of pre-mortem clarity, where people nearing death suddenly become lucid and speak profound, final words to their loved ones, is often cited in palliative care. It seems this diner reverses that process, giving the living the benefit of the dead's final, focused clarity. The young woman received her guidance, her anchor. The next customer arrived about an hour later. He was a stark contrast to the nervous seeker and the anxious student. He was older, perhaps late 40s or early 50s, his face heavily lined, wearing the visible history of hard times. He walked with a slight limp and carried an aggressive, almost dangerous air, suggesting he wasn't accustomed to hearing the word no. He didn't look around. He didn't hesitate. He came straight up to the counter and sat down, a man on a mission. Coffee, he stated. Black. You poured the cup and slid it across to him. He stared at the coffee, then at you. You do that thing here, right? The conversation thing. You nodded. Yeah, you know the rules. I know the rules, he said, his voice tight, coiled with a hidden energy. He glanced around the empty diner again, then leaned closer. I want to talk to someone. Who? An accountant. He spat the word out, the sheer bitterness of it hanging in the air. Bastard stole from me. Took everything. This was fundamentally different. The sacred space for grief and closure was about to be used for rage and confrontation. This is the moment you realize the ritual, like any powerful force, has no moral compass. It serves the desire, regardless of the intention. You hesitated. Every prior transaction had been driven by a yearning for reconnection, a desperate desire to voice the unsaid words to a lost, loved one. This man, Gary, was here for reckoning, not closure. He was seeking vengeance on a ghost. But you are only the custodian, not the judge. The rules don't specify the emotional motivation, only the mechanical execution. Okay, you conceded. Just remember no touching and drink the coffee before it goes cold. The second rule in this context felt more like a warning, a barrier against physical violence. Gary didn't acknowledge you. He took a long, hard sip of the coffee, holding the mug with a fierce grip, and set it down. The transformation of the air was quicker this time, laced with a palpable sense of anger that made your skin prickle. A moment later, the corner booth, always faintly shrouded in shadow, was no longer vacant. A man materialized, sharp and present. He was dressed in a cheap, slightly rumpled suit, with thin glasses perched near the end of his nose. He looked startled, glancing around the diner with a confused, panicked expression, clearly unsure where he was or why he had been summoned. Then his eyes locked onto Gary, and his expression instantly hardened into cold, defensive recognition. Gary, the accountant said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. You, Gary snarled, his hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles were white. You ruined me. You stole everything I had. The accountant, even as a ghost, maintained a chilling indifference. I did my job, he replied coldly. You were the one who didn't read the fine print. Don't give me that garbage, Gary snapped, his face reddening with mounting fury. I trusted you. I won the lottery, and you bled me dry. The stakes of this confrontation were immediately clear. Not a broken heart, but a broken life, built on betrayal. Their voices rose, sharp and angry, shattering the usual quiet solemnity of the ritual. You kept your distance, moving to fiddle with the napkin dispenser again, pretending to be absorbed in the task. But your ears were strained. This wasn't a conversation. It was an interrogation, a forced, agonizing reckoning. You could have stopped, Gary shouted, his face now a dangerous, furious red. You could have left me something, anything, the accountant shrugged, his spectral indifference now laced with a cruel edge. Well, the thing is, I don't like you, Gary. That statement, so simple, so cutting, delivered by a man who had already been judged by death, snapped something inside Gary. His hands began to shake violently, and for a terrifying moment, you thought he was going to lunge across the counter and grab the ghost, breaking the cardinal rule of no touching. Instead, Gary grabbed the mug. He didn't drink it, didn't set it down. He grabbed the ceramic handle and hurled the cup violently to the floor. The sound was immense, a deafening explosion of ceramic shattering against the tiles, echoing through the empty diner. Coffee splattered everywhere, dark, hot, and steaming across the gray floor. The accountant disappeared instantly. One moment he was there, smug and indifferent, and the next he was utterly gone, as if a cosmic switch had been flipped, cutting the power to his presence. Gary stood there, breathing heavily, his fists clenched, the residual fury barely contained. Then, without a word, he turned and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him with a resonant clap. You sighed, the adrenaline draining slowly, leaving you with the mess. You grabbed a mop and a dustpan. As you cleaned up the splintered ceramic and mopped the dark stain, you couldn't help but analyze the metaphysical accident. You had always assumed the only termination mechanism was time, waiting for the coffee to naturally cool. But apparently, immediate, violent destruction of the vessel, the physical host of the ritual, ended the service just as abruptly. You made a careful mental note of this terrible new rule. Smashing the cup is a manual termination. It's a dark, new fact, like a psychological study, where a seemingly benign condition, drinking coffee, is revealed to have a hidden, destructive failsafe. It reminds you of the old superstition that breaking a mirror releases bad fortune here. Breaking the mug releases the ghost, but only because the container holding the heat, and therefore the connection, is destroyed. The rain started up that evening, a relentless, heavy drumming against the diner's windows. The broken neon sign outside buzzed faintly, a miserable sound, casting those flickering, broken reflections of red and blue onto the wet, slick pavement. The damp, metallic smell of rain and old asphalt filled the air. You had just finished mopping the last dark stain from Gary's destructive departure. When the bell over the door jingled again, he looked up, expecting another lonely trucker. But the man who stepped inside was different. He shook the rain off a heavy, dark coat, stomping his boots deliberately on the entrance mat. He was broad-shouldered, with sharp, determined features, and an unquestionable air of authority that clung to him like the damp of the rain. His eyes, though they were the real story, they were tired, profoundly heavy, carrying a weight far deeper and more complex than mere exhaustion. They looked like they'd seen the absolute worst of the world and were now asking the worst of you. "You Rick?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "That's me," you said, leaning on the counter, the same posture of guarded neutrality. "What can I do for you?" The man looked carefully around the completely empty diner, a professional habit, ensuring there were no witnesses. He then walked up to the counter and, in one practiced motion, pulled out a badge. He held it just long enough for you to register the official shield before he tucked it away again. "Detective Andrews," he introduced himself. "I've heard some things about this place." You sighed inwardly, already knowing, with a cold certainty, exactly where this conversation was heading. "What kind of things?" He shifted, uncomfortable, the professional mask briefly slipping, his jaw tightened. "That you have a service, something to do with coffee and the dead." You studied him for a long moment. He was clearly a hardened skeptic, a man of facts and evidence, not folklore or rumors. Yet here he was, standing in your dimly lit, rain-soaked diner, desperation etched deeply into every line on his face. The urgency of his need had overridden his entire professional belief system. "You know the rules?" you asked, the question of formality. "I've heard them," he confirmed, the recitation sounding practiced and mechanical. "Drink the coffee before it goes cold. No touching. One chance only, then you know how it works," you finished. "Who do you want to talk to?" He hesitated, his hand clenching into a tight fist on the counter, battling with the name he was about to invoke. "A man named Victor Kane." The name hit you like a physical shock, a cold jolt to the system. Even living under a rock, as you feel you do, you had heard of Victor Kane. He was the infamous serial killer, the ghost of the region's past, whose horrific spree had terrorized the local community years ago. He was dead now, killed in a prison riot, but his crimes had left deep, unhealing scars on the collective psyche. "Why him?" you asked, your voice automatically dropping to a quieter register. The moral stakes of the ritual had just skyrocketed. Andrews ran a tired hand through his rain-dampened hair, his eyes darting to the window before locking onto yours, a silent plea in their depths. "There's another killer out there, someone worse," he admitted, his voice strained. "We found a body yesterday, mutilated in ways I won't describe. But there were details that match Kane's work. Problem is, Kane's dead. If this is a copycat, they're taking it to a whole new level. I need answers, Rick. And if there's even a chance that bastard knows something, I'll take it. He was asking you to open a gateway for pure, concentrated malice, the folklore of the Dybbuk box, a wine cabinet supposedly haunted by a restless, malicious spirit, comes to mind. You are being asked to open your own Dybbuk box for the sake of an investigation. Researchers still argue whether the bystander effect, the psychological phenomenon where individuals are less likely to offer help when other people are present, applies to moral dilemmas. But standing here alone with a detective, you realize the pressure to comply is immense. Whether or not you agree with the choice, you felt a deep, profound sense of wrongness about what Detective Andrews was asking. But the rules of the diner service had always been clear. You facilitate. You don't censor. The cup is offered to anyone who knows the terms and is willing to pay the price. You're sure about this? You asked one last time, needing him to acknowledge the terrible risk. Do I look like I have another option? He snapped, the frustration of the impossible case momentarily boiling over. He then sighed, softening his tone, pulling himself back from the edge. Sorry, just please, let me do this. You nodded reluctantly, a cold knot forming in your stomach, and poured the cup of black coffee. As you set it on the counter, you couldn't shake the feeling that you were, quite literally, lighting the fuse on something explosive. Andrews took the mug. His hand, despite the immense weight of the task and the moral compromise, was surprisingly steady. He walked across the room, past the cheerful humming jukebox, and sat down in a booth in the corner, staring at the coffee as if it were a bomb, not a beverage. Then, with a deep, visible breath, he took a sip. The diner immediately went utterly still. The silence was no longer heavy with grief or expectation, but with a cold, malignant anticipation. You remained behind the counter, watching Andrews sit rigid in his seat. For a terrifying moment, the silence stretched and nothing happened. You almost hoped it wouldn't work, that the universe had a moral safeguard in place. But then, the air in the diner didn't just thicken or grow heavy. It seemed to grow colder, actively colder, and a figure appeared across from Andrews. Victor Kane was exactly as you remembered from the faded, terrible mugshots, tall, gaunt, with deeply sunken eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room and pierce right through you, assessing your weakness. But there was something far worse than the mugshots suggested. He didn't just look real, he looked profoundly, utterly wrong. His presence was immediate and overwhelming, filling the small diner like a suffocating storm cloud, a palpable, oppressive malice that made it hard to draw a clean breath. Andrews, a professional, didn't flinch. Victor Kane, he said, his voice level and steady, an impressive feat of self-control. The ghost smiled. It wasn't human. It was the kind of smile that made every instinct scream at you to turn and run, to break the windows, and flee into the dark rain. Detective Andrews, he replied, his voice smooth, cultured, and laced with mockery. What an unexpected pleasure. I need information, Andrew said, cutting past the pleasantries, straight to the ugly core of the request. There's a killer out there mimicking your work. I need to know who it could be. Kane leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms, a ghost of arrogance. Oh, I'm flattered, truly, but why in the darkest pits of hell would I help you? Because if you don't, more people will die, Andrews pressed, his tone hardening. And I don't think even you want someone stealing your spotlight. Kane's smile widened, revealing a chilling delight. You're wrong about that, detective. I don't mind a little competition. Keeps things interesting. It's a fundamental concept in psychology that some individuals, often those scoring high on the dark triad, narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, derive satisfaction not just from power, but from observing the chaos their influence creates. This ghost was clearly enjoying the chaos. Andrews clenched his fists, leaning forward, fighting the urge to shatter the mug himself. This isn't a game, Kane. Just tell me what you know. The ghost's expression darkened, the cruel humor fading into something more sinister. You don't get it, do you? You think I have answers, but I don't. Whoever this is, they're not copying me. They're surpassing me, and frankly, I think that's beautiful. The true horror wasn't Kane, but the suggestion of someone worse. Andrews slammed his hand onto the table, the metallic echo of the booth shaking the very air. Damn it, Kane. People are dying. Don't you care at all? Kane's laughter filled the diner, cold, hollow, and utterly deranged. Care? Oh, detective, you really don't understand me at all. The moment Kane spoke that line, the atmosphere didn't just change, it broke. This was the first time a ghost had actively manifested rage. Plates began to rattle furiously on the high shelves. The fluorescent lights above flickered wildly, strobing the scene in rapid bursts. Your heart began to pound a frantic, trapped rhythm against your ribs as you watched, paralyzed. As one of the ceramic plates flew off the cabinet, launched by an invisible force, and smashed against the window glass, another followed instantly, then another, the sound of shattering ceramic echoing through the small, enclosed space. Kane stood, rising from the booth. His presence seemed to physically swell, looming larger, transforming from a ghost of a man into a terrifying specter of menace. Oh, detective, he said, his voice now dripping with a malicious, concentrated glee. You thought you could control this. You thought I'd play by your little rules before either you or Andrews could process the impossible shift. Kane turned his head sharply, his dark, empty eyes locked onto something or someone behind you. You slowly followed his gaze and instantly froze in pure terror. Maya. She was the waitress who occasionally worked the late evening shifts, a bright, cheerful presence you hadn't even heard come in. She was standing near the counter, holding a tray piled high with clean silverware. She looked stunned, her mouth slightly open, staring directly at the terrifying figure of Victor Kane. She must have slipped through the back door to avoid the downpour. A simple, mundane act that had placed her directly in the path of a supernatural killer. Kane's smile widened into a predatory grin, faster than you could track, faster than you thought a spectral figure could move. He was suddenly next to her. A knife. One of your own kitchen knives. A cheap steak knife from the drawer. Materialized in his hand. He held it, the dull stainless steel glinting under the strobing lights, pressed right against the delicate skin of her neck. Maya let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her tray clattered to the floor, forks and knives scattering everywhere. A mundane sound of disaster, swallowed by the terror of the moment. Not another step, Kane commanded, his voice eerily, calmly in control. Oh, don't worry, Rick. I'm not going to kill her. Not yet. I just want to see what happens when I break all your little rules. What the hell is this? Andrews barked, pulling his gun from its holster, the slide clicking back. The weapon was useless, a symbol of mortal law against a creature of the beyond. He's a ghost. He shouldn't be able to touch her. Shouldn't, but can, Kane corrected, pressing the blade just a fraction closer to Maya's skin. She whimpered, tears instantly streaming down her pale face. And isn't that fun? The psychological concept of learned helplessness, the feeling that one cannot escape a negative situation, is what you feel watching Maya's terror. Realizing the rules you relied on are meaningless here. It's a dark truth. Every ghost before this had chosen to follow the rules, but this one never would. You realize that Victor Kane is not a memory summoned by the coffee. He is something worse, something capable of using the ritual as a bridge. You grabbed the coffee cup from the table where Andrews had been sitting. Without hesitation, you hurled it to the ground, smashing it into a dozen desperate pieces, trying to repeat the manual termination that had worked with Gary. Kane didn't even flinch. Nice try, he mocked, his voice laced with patronizing contempt. But I don't think your little parlor trick works the way you think it does. The shattered ceramic did nothing. Rick, Andrews yelled, his gun still trained uselessly on the phantom killer. What do we do? Your mind was racing, paralyzed, and yet hyper-focused by the surge of adrenaline and raw panic. The rules. You desperately scanned the immutable laws of the ritual, seeking a loophole, a hidden escape clause, until the coffee gets cold. That was the fundamental, non-negotiable end condition. The coffee, the mug was shattered, destroyed, but the dark liquid, the substance of the connection, was pooled on the floor where it had been violently thrown. A faint, wispy steam was still rising from the puddle, confirming that it was still warm, still chemically active. The connection wasn't in the mug. It was in the temperature of the liquid. While Kane was focused on the armed, professional threat of Detective Andrews, his back momentarily turned toward the counter. You acted purely on instinct. You bolted behind the counter and grabbed the nearest, largest container you could find, a tall, heavy metal pitcher of fresh, cold tap water you kept for general use. Without a second thought, you rushed back out to the booth and poured the entire contents of the icy cold water directly over the steaming puddle of black coffee on the floor. The reaction was instantaneous, violent, and absolute. Kane stiffened, his head snapping toward you, his dark eyes wide with shock and pure, spectral fury. The knife, released from his grasp, fell from Maya's neck and clattered loudly onto the tiles. His form began to flicker wildly, like a terrible, unstable signal on an old analog television. He let out a low, inhuman, guttural sound, a roar of pure frustration and pain, his face twisting into something far more monstrous and less human than it had been before. This was the reality beneath the polite suit. And then he was gone, just like that. The instant the cold water hit the warm coffee, the storm cloud vanished. The diner was silent again. The only sounds the steady patter of the relentless rain and Maya's quiet, broken sobs. Maya stumbled away from the exact spot where Kane had been standing, clutching her arms, trying desperately to hold her suddenly fragile body together. "It's over," you whispered, your own hands shaking so badly that you dropped the empty pitcher onto the counter. "It's over." Andrews lowered his gun slowly, his expression dark, a mix of disbelief and profound shock. "You knew that would work." "I didn't know," you admitted, wiping the cold sweat from your forehead. "But the rules said, until the coffee gets cold." "I figured cold water would do the trick." The physical force of temperature had overridden the psychological force of the summoning. Andrews nodded slowly, holstering the gun, the sound heavy in the silence. You turned to Maya, who was still trembling by the counter, utterly pale. "Maggie, are you okay?" you asked gently. She nodded weakly, unable to speak a full sentence. I think so." "Go home," you ordered softly, the adrenaline still thrumming. "Get some rest. I'll cover the rest of your shift." She nodded again, her movements stiff and uncoordinated, and hurried out the back door, disappearing into the sound of the rain. The folklore of the vulnerable soul, where spirits can only manifest or cause physical harm under certain environmental conditions, like a blood moon, or in this case, a warm cup of coffee, is now proven true. This diner is not haunted. It's thermodynamically active. Detective Andrews stayed for a moment, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning not with relief, but with frustrated failure and shock. He was a man of the law, a man of tangible evidence, and he had just witnessed an impossible, terrifying violation of every law he knew. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice low and heavy. "I didn't know it would get out of control like that." "It's not your fault," you lied, the words feeling hollow and inadequate even as you said them. You knew it was the fault of the place, the fault of the ritual, and the fault of the inherent malice of Victor Kane. Andrews nodded, running a hand roughly through his wet hair. "I thought I could handle it. I thought, hell, I don't know what I thought." You didn't offer any platitudes. There was nothing left to say that wasn't already soaked into the floor and scattered with the broken plates. He turned toward the door, defeated. "Thanks for stepping in, Rick. You saved her." Yeah, you said, avoiding his gaze, focused instead on the dark, muddy puddle of cold coffee and water on the floor. Just don't come back for this, not for this. Andrews didn't reply. He simply pushed the door open and walked out into the rain, the sound of the doorbell a final, weary signal of his departure. You were left alone with the wreckage, the broken pieces of ceramic, the spilled, cooling liquid, and the faint, lingering smell of coffee that had become synonymous with grief and now terror. You grabbed the mop again and began the arduous, depressing task of cleaning up the supernatural crime scene. The days after the Victor Kane incident passed in a strange, uneasy blur. The diner quickly returned to its usual quiet rhythm, just enough business to keep the lights from dimming, just enough isolation to keep the secret safe. The regulars, lost in their own routines, noticed nothing unusual. New customers, oblivious, simply ordered their food and left, none the wiser. But for you, everything had changed. The chilling, oppressive memory of Victor Kane's ghost, his mocking voice, and the sight of his knife at Maya's throat still lingered, a heavy weight in the back of your mind. Every time you brewed a fresh pot of coffee, you found yourself glancing quickly over your shoulder, half expecting the air to chill, the plates to rattle, or a gaunt, malevolent figure to materialize in the corner. You told yourself that it was over. You had followed the rules, or rather, you had discovered a new, violent way to enforce the cooling rule. And you had put the entire terrible event behind you. But late at night, when the diner was completely empty, and the only sounds were the soft, constant hum of the old refrigerator, and the occasional, nervous creak of the floorboards, the weight of the secret and the trauma pressed down on you with a physical force, you found yourself forgetting small, simple things, leaving salt shakers empty, neglecting to flip the sign to open on a couple of mornings. Simple clerical errors that indicated a deeper neurological strain. Maya, thankfully, had returned to work, patient and quiet, gently reminding you of the small chores. She didn't blame you, no one did. But the act of running the diner, the simple, predictable daily routine, now felt heavier than ever before. It's a strange, well-documented psychological fact that continuous exposure to low-grade stress or high-stakes trauma can lead to chronic fatigue and significant cognitive impairment, often mimicking the symptoms of depression. You are experiencing that very real toll of carrying an impossible secret. This is not fiction. This is the reality of living in a haunted place. The tension of the past few weeks felt like a tight wire stretched across your chest. Every customer was a potential threat. Every cup of coffee a loaded weapon. You tried to focus on the predictable, the physical, the scrub brush, the steel counter, the scent of industrial cleaner. You desperately needed to reset your mind. It was late one night, or rather, very early morning, when it happened. The clock on the wall, its faded face illuminated by the low light, read 3:18 a.m. diner was utterly empty, wrapped in the profound, consuming quiet of the deepest hour. The rain was back, a soft, relentless patter against the windows, a gentle rhythm that amplified the loneliness of the night. You were trying to keep busy, scrubbing the already clean counter for what felt like the 10th time, trying to work the anxiety out of your system through sheer physical labor. It was a futile gesture, but it kept the paranoia at bay. Then, on pure, exhausted instinct, you decided to make yourself a cup of coffee. You needed the caffeine, the warmth, the simple, familiar ritual of the brewing. You didn't think about the implications, didn't consider the terms and conditions. You just grabbed a clean mug, poured the rich, black liquid from the hot pot, and set it on the counter. You didn't drink it immediately. You let it sit there, steaming gently, a dark beacon of comfort, as you turned away to organize the perpetually disorganized collection of napkins and condiment packets. The smell of the coffee was warm, rich, and so profoundly familiar that, for the first time in weeks, you felt a brief, perfect moment of calm. The simple scent cut through the terror and the paranoia. Then you heard it. Ricky. The sound was low, soft, coming from immediately behind you. It was the only sound in the dead quiet diner that wasn't rain or the hum of machinery, and it cut through the air with a terrible familiarity. Your heart stuttered, skipped a beat, and then began to pound with a slow, heavy dread. Only one person in the world was ever allowed to call you Ricky. Your dad. You turned slowly, carefully, your eyes first landing on the mug of black coffee sitting untouched on the counter, the steam still curling gently upward. You had done it. Without realizing it, you had performed the ritual for yourself. And then you saw him. He was sitting on one of the stools, the same stool he always occupied when you worked together. A lifetime ago, he looked exactly, perfectly as you remembered him. Broad shoulders, the familiar dusting of gray in his hair, and that gentle, easy smile that could genuinely light up the dusty, neon-flickering room. His favorite flannel shirt, worn soft over the years, was neatly tucked into his old jeans, and his hands rested casually on the counter, as if he had never left, as if the last 3 years of grief and fear had been a terrible, bad dream. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice warm, familiar, and absolutely real. You stared at him, unable to breathe, your throat suddenly tightening with the weight of unshed tears and unspoken years. "Dad?" "Yeah," he said, his smile softening around the edges, confirmation in his eyes. "It's me." 100 fragmented thoughts, grief, fear, relief, guilt, raced through your mind, but none of them could organize into language. Finally, you managed a strangled confession. "I didn't mean to call you." "I know," he said, nodding towards the mug. "Guess it just worked out that way." You sank onto the stool across from him, your body heavy, your hands trembling slightly. You realize this moment, this forced, accidental reunion, is the psychological horror you feared the most. Using your one chance, not by choice, but by exhaustion and accident. It's a cruel twist of fate, but it's also undeniably real. Researchers still argue whether coincidence is a factor of human pattern recognition or true stochastic randomness. But you know in your heart, this accidental brew was the only way you could have ever given yourself permission to summon him. How are you here? You managed to ask, the simple words feeling vast and impossible. He chuckled, a rich, familiar sound that momentarily chased the silence out of the corners of the room. Same way all those other folks show up, I suppose. You made the coffee, and well, I figured it was about time we had a talk. About what? About you, he said simply, his gaze steady and deep. And this place. You sat in silence for a long moment. The gentle tapping of the rain against the windows, the only backdrop to this impossible conversation. This was the moment of reckoning, the final, inevitable check-in. Finally, he spoke again, his voice gentle, yet holding an undeniable firmness that you remembered from your childhood. You've been doing a good job, Ricky. Better than I ever could have hoped for, keeping the place running, looking after it like it mattered. I'm proud of you for that. You felt a huge, painful lump constricting your throat, forcing you to look down at your hands, unable to meet the love and pride in his gaze. I didn't want to let you down. You haven't, he assured you, his voice unwavering. Not once. But Rick, it's time to let it go. You looked up at him, shocked, the words cutting through the emotional fog. What? This diner, he said, making a slow, sweeping gesture around the small, tired room. It's a part of me, sure, a part of us. But it's not all there is. Not for you. He was telling you the truth you had spent 3 years carefully avoiding. You shook your head, the denial instantaneous, the words catching painfully in your throat. I don't know how to let it go, Dad. It's all I've had since you left. He reached out, the same instinctual, loving gesture the grandmother had made, wanting desperately to touch you, to offer comfort, but he stopped just short, his fingers hovering an inch above the cool, stainless steel counter, maintaining the sacred, terrible boundary. I know, son, but this isn't your dream. It never was, he said. You stayed because you thought you had to, because you're a good son. But you've been holding on to this place, and to me, for too long. Tears pricked at the corners of your eyes, blurring the edges of his familiar face. You blinked them away, ashamed of the simple vulnerability. I don't even know what I want anymore. I haven't thought about it in so long. Yes, you do, he countered, his voice steady and resolute. You've always wanted more than this. You wanted to move to the city, chase your dreams. You wanted to live your life, and you still can. This place doesn't have to hold you back. The philosophical concept of the ship of Theseus, asking if an object is still the same after all its parts have been replaced, resonates here. The diner is still physically the same, but without your father, it has lost its original, meaningful identity. But what about, you started, trying to find a reason, a way to stay tethered to the past? He cut you off gently, kindly. not with a command, but with a final reassurance. I'll always be with you, Ricky, no matter where you go or what you do. You don't need this diner to remember me. You've already got me here. He tapped his chest, right over his heart, a universally understood gesture of eternal presence. You looked away, your vision completely blurring now, unable to hold back the flood of grief and relief that finally broke. I don't know how to say goodbye, you admitted, the confession raw and quiet, tasting of salt and unshed tears. You don't have to, he said simply. You're not saying goodbye to me, just to this place. It's okay to move on, Rick. You've done your part. He gave you the ultimate permission, the final blessing you hadn't realized you were waiting for. You talked for a long while after that. Not about the diner's terrible secret or Victor Kane, but about the mundane, comforting memories. He reminded you of the time he taught you to flip pancakes without using a spatula. The frustrating evenings spent trying to fix the leaky roof. And all the small, simple acts of a life lived together. His voice remained steady, calm, and utterly familiar. And for the first time in 3 long, lonely years, you felt an immense physical pressure lift from your lungs. You could breathe again. But time, even spectral time, is finite. The coffee was growing cold, and you could feel the presence across the counter becoming infinitesimally fainter. He sensed it, too. His beautiful, easy smile turned bittersweet, acknowledging the inevitable end of their single coin. Ricky, he said, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate level. Promise me you'll think about what I said. Promise me you'll take that step. You nodded, the simple movement difficult, your voice cracking with the effort of control. I promise. Good, he said, his final smile widening into pure, unburdened happiness. That's my boy. And then he was gone. There was no chilling cold, no flickering light, no shattering plates. He simply wasn't there anymore. The stool he'd been sitting on was empty, perfectly unoccupied. The only things left were the faint, residual scent of coffee and the steady, quiet sound of the rain outside. You sat there for a very long time, staring at the mug in front of you. The coffee was now perfectly cold, untouched by your lips, but the warmth he had left behind, the warmth of his permission, remained deep in your chest. You had broken the first terrible rule. You hadn't drunk the coffee, and he had vanished before the ritual was complete. Yet, the conversation had been complete. His presence, unlike Sam's Emma or Gary's accountant, wasn't dependent on the consumption, but on the connection. Maybe the rules were for the users, not for the ghosts. Your dad was right. It was time to let go. Time to finally move on. You didn't know what the future held the city. A new job, a fresh start. But for the first time in years, you felt a profound, exhilarating readiness to find out. The quiet of the diner, once oppressive, now felt like a blank page waiting to be written upon. The horror was gone, replaced by a strange, final sense of freedom. The myth of the wandering Jew focuses on a figure cursed to eternal existence and perpetual movement. Unable to find rest or sanctuary for 3 years, you have been the opposite, cursed to stay, bound to one place. Your father's final act, the ultimate sacrifice of your one chance, has now lifted that curse, giving you the freedom to wander if you choose, but more importantly, the freedom to rest. You finally picked up the cold, untouched mug, the simple ceramic feeling heavy and meaningful, and you dumped the black coffee down the drain, ceremoniously ending the era. The next morning, the diner felt different. The air was cleaner, the light through the windows brighter. You went through the motions, brewing the coffee, wiping the counter, but your movements were lighter, your focus already shifting outward. You didn't look over your shoulder once. Maya came in for her shift, looking much better, though still subdued. She noticed the difference immediately. "You look rested," she commented, tying her apron. "I think I am," you replied honestly, the first true smile you genuinely felt in months touching your lips. You spent the day organizing the necessary paperwork. You called a realtor. You put the diner up for sale. You weren't selling the ritual, you were selling the property, the building, the chrome, the red leather. The ritual was simply a part of the house, and it would belong to the next owner. A chilling legacy you couldn't erase, only abandon. You kept the old neon sign, the Blue Ridge Diner flicker, as a reminder of the strange history you were leaving behind. That night, you went upstairs to your small apartment, the saggy bed and kitchenette, and you started packing. The feeling of making decisions, simple ones, like deciding what to keep and what to toss, was invigorating. You realized that the psychological comfort of predictability had trapped you, and the shock of Victor Kane, coupled with the final, gentle release from your father, was the only thing that could have broken you free. The quiet life, once a refuge, had become a cage, and now the door was open. You packed the photo of your father, his favorite old, faded flannel shirt, and the pie recipe. Everything else, all the chrome and the red leather, belonged to the building. You even left a simple, unsigned note on the counter for the next owner. Always check the temperature. Let them figure out the rest. That's the nature of a curse. It has to be discovered, not handed over. Before you finally locked the front door for the very last time, you stood in the middle of the empty, silent diner. You walked over to the booth where Sam had spoken to Emma. The booth where the young woman had received guidance from her grandmother. And the corner booth where Detective Andrews had faced pure malice. You ran your hand over the smooth, worn leather. A final, silent acknowledgement of the thousands of tears and whispered words this place had held. You were leaving the ghost world behind. You stepped out into the dark, rainy night, pulling the heavy door shut behind you. The bell jingled one last time, a final, sharp, liberating sound. You looked at the flickering neon sign, still stuck on its broken blue and red pulse, the Blue Ridge Diner, and you felt nothing but cold finality. You realized that this entire experience, this whole 3-year detour into the strange and supernatural, was itself a form of delayed grief therapy, a terrible, profound mechanism that forced you to address the unsaid things you needed to say goodbye, and the only way the universe would allow it was through an accidental brew in the dead of night. You turned your back on the diner, the smell of burnt coffee and rain already fading as you walked toward your waiting car, heading toward the city, toward the dreams that were still waiting for you. The quiet life was over. The predictable routine was shattered. And for the first time in years, you were finally free of the weight of the dead. You are now the one who is walking toward the warmth, leaving the cold, spectral connection behind. The silence of the highway felt like a promise. It's time to take a deep, slow breath. The story ends, but the lingering feeling of that impossible reunion, of the chilling malice of Victor Kane, might stay with you for a while. That's okay. That's the nature of the dark stories. They leave a residue. But the light is coming back up. You can feel the tension in your shoulders ease. Remember, the horror was confined to that small, strange diner, and you are far away from the flickering neon sign and the ghost-invoking coffee pot. You are back in your safe space. If you're still feeling that little shiver, remember the final comfort. The rules of the horror were broken, and the living were saved. The most important conversation was the one about permission, the one that ended the cycle. You have closure, and you have freedom. Thank you for tuning in tonight, for sharing this journey into the deepest parts of the dark, and for letting me whisper this chilling story into your headphones. Until next time, be safe, be well, and don't look too closely at the steam rising from your coffee cup. End of script. Sleep peacefully if you can. End of script. Sleep peacefully if you can.